All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We check out great, impactful theories and discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces that you probably have never heard of before because they've been suppressed. People who spent their whole life working on something only to be ignored. And in many cases, to die penniless and in obscurity. But this is our 255th Bible Decode, and we've been looking at the somewhat suppressed theory of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. They they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by about 40 years. And they did this for the purpose of really a psychological operation against the Jews. They were trying to mellow out the Jews, or to prune the Jews, to domesticate or tame the Jews, who had been a big pain in the Roman side ever since the Romans rolled into Judea in 63 BC as the new colonial power. And so this has been over 125 years, 130 years of unrest, revolutions and riots and uprisings and revolts and assassinations and terrorist attacks from the Jews who, saw themselves as the chosen people and were very, xenophobic and separatist in their ways, liking to keep to their traditions and their rituals and their strictures that were very strict. And the Romans were, tolerant of their religion, but they wanted them to also recognize the Romans' religion, Caesar as God, and so on. And, some other pagan lore as well. They wanted to be able to put a statue of the emperor into the Jewish temple. That didn't go over well when Emperor Caligula tried that and almost turned it into a full-blown war. Well, there was a full-blown war in 66 AD in Jerusalem when really three self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs. Now remember, the Jews from the New Testament, from Old Testament scriptures, were waiting for a Messiah that had been predicted in the Old Testament. And the Messiah they were waiting for was one who was a military commander who would help the Romans overthrow the Jews. Help the Jews overthrow the Romans. And that literally happened in 66 AD, albeit just for a short while, where the self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs overthrew the Herod king, whose name was Agrippa II, and he was sent packing back to Rome. But then he got there and told Emperor Nero about it, and Emperor Nero sent in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. So Vespasian eventually became emperor, but for now he is the military commander there. Now, when Nero is assassinated and then three more emperors are assassinated, Vespasian becomes the new emperor in 69 AD. And so he goes back to Rome and he appoints his son Titus to be the new military commander in Judea. It took the Romans literally 7 years to put down this Jewish revolt or war. And both Vespasian and Titus were wounded in the battles, and both Vespasian and Titus were pretty sick of dealing with the Jews, especially now that they were, in the imperial palace. And so, they decided to write a story of a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and turning the other cheek to oppression. And at the same time, going to the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers, changing out the dirty Roman money for the kosher Jewish money so that it could be used for the merchants who Jesus also denigrated, who were selling small animals for the sacrifice at the temple. And so, and Jesus is, getting his disciples together and encouraging them to abandon their families, leave them behind without even a goodbye. And so Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish traditions, rituals, and, folklore, and meanwhile being utterly deferential to the Romans, almost as if he was created by the Romans. And then when we get into the Pauline material, the epistles of Paul, so-called, we recognize that Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus was, and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. Neither of these characters throughout the New Testament do anything to resist Roman rule, but they do a whole lot to oppose the Jews. And that is kind of the circumstantial evidence and the motive. The Romans, this is right in their bailiwick in terms of their method of operation. They had created other religions for the purpose of psychological operations during the first century. The Romans were the only people who had the means and opportunity to pull this off, especially given that they had a monopoly on censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire. No one was printing anything in the first century unless it was approved of by Caesar. And so that's really the circumstances behind the New Testament. But in order to really understand what's going on, you need another book, which is really like a code breaker, that the Romans wrote at the same time that they wrote the New Testament, or at least the early books, the gospel books. A lot of the other books were written by the children of these Flavians in a later period. Most scholars believe that the Pauline epistles are written earlier, not later. But the only reason is that Paul could have referred to the Gospels in a number of different places, but does not. And from that, they extrapolate that that's because Paul was writing before the Gospels, but there's a lot of evidence to show that they were written in a later period. But anyway, the Gospels, when you read them in conjunction with the history of the war between the Jews and the Romans, and that book is called, in 7 volumes, War of the Jews. They wrote that at the same time, for the same reason, by the same people, as the Gospels. And this book went out under the name of Flavius Josephus, or Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. So we know that Josephus, the Jewish war, is a product of the Romans. And then when we compare it with the New Testament, we find that the amount of parallels are far, far too high to be any type of coincidence. Michael Menescott, in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, looked into the book of Luke and found over 250 parallels just in Luke. And many of them are detailed, complicated, involved, incredibly well hidden and woven into the texts, requiring a great amount of work to really do this. The Romans put in the time on writing these two documents, especially the book of Luke and War of the Jews, but the other Gospels as well. And also Menescott then graphed all of the 250 parallels that he found, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis, a War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, charting all of the parallels, created 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, TV being Titus and Vespasian. The Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they literally signed their name on it, just so that we would eventually figure it out. It's been almost 2,000 years, but we're getting there. I think people like me, videos like this will eventually get the word out that the Romans wrote the New Testament. There's absolutely no evidence for the existence of Jesus, because all the evidence for the existence of Jesus is Roman. And so instead, the Romans were in on it. They weren't corroborating the existence of Jesus. They were creating the existence of Jesus. And many other things too. This does not just go against Christianity. It's also completely goes against Satanism. Satan is also a creation of the Romans and does not exist. There is scant allusion to Satan in the Old Testament, but whenever Satan appears, I think about 5 times, he's always a human being who serves as an obstacle or an impediment. But in the New Testament, Satan gains this supernatural status, which is then amplified in books like Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost, and then amplified, even more by the Jews in Hollywood. And so I guess, Satan is in the Jewish lexicon, but not until the 20th century. But probably most of our images and vision of and our imagination of Satan is really more from Hollywood. Jesus as well. I think a lot of especially you watch a lot of the Christian, truther videos, and their depictions of Jesus are always from Hollywood. They're always using some kind of movie or some kind of film to depict Jesus. If they opened up their book, they would first wonder, why is Jesus so pro-Roman all the time? And then they would recognize that there is a very nursery rhymey quality to all of this, and that really Jesus has the same ontological status as Santa Claus. No evidence whatsoever. You have to believe in him through blind faith because there isn't any evidence. And I think that would be anathema to a truther. There's actually more evidence for Santa than there is for Jesus, because with Santa you can at least refer to your local weatherman on on Christmas Eve, when they say, "Oh, the radar is showing that Santa's sleigh is now leaving the North Pole and is on his way down, to give out toys." And so at least there's some evidence of the existence of Santa and your meteorologist on one day a year. Anyway, Joseph Atwill has also discovered that the ministry of Jesus is nothing but a replica of the military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. In the same order, they experience parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years. And there's over 40 plus separate events that are all in the same order in both books, the Book of Luke and War of the Jews. We've looked at many other books, to kind of demonstrate the explanatory power of the Roman origins hypothesis, that it basically just explains everything. All you need to do is take that leap into the idea that this whole thing is a psyop, which the truthers should very much understand. They know what a psyop looks like in the 20th and 21st century. It looks exactly the same in the first century. And if you know what the fingerprints and what a psyop looks like, this is what it looks like. So we've looked at some other authors who have skirted around the Roman origins hypothesis, as well as hitting it right in the square, because there's about 10 or 12 proponents of this Roman origins hypothesis full on at this point, and then a number of other people who are probably unfamiliar with the Roman origins hypothesis, but their evidence shows them that something is way wrong here. Why is Jesus so pro-Roman and anti-Jew? Why is Paul even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew? Right now, we've gotten into a new book that we're just starting. We're looking at a few of. It's kind of a compendium of different his shorter books and some articles, and this is Robert Eisenman's The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls is somewhat of a wild card here, because it was probably written in the first century. At least some of it was written in the first century. Some of it might have been written a little earlier. But it wasn't discovered until the 20th century. So that leaves a lot of room for possible fraud right there. But assuming that it is legitimate, these manuscripts were discovered in vases and in a series of caves outside of Qumran, which is about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and not right on the shores of the Dead Sea. And it took the scholarly community, mostly these Dominican priests, who were assigned to translate these things from the original Hebrew and Aramaic mostly, and they must have found something that they didn't like, because they took over 40 years to really put out anything of substance. And Eisenman was one of the key people involved in forcing these Dominicans to divulge these texts. The academic community, the theologians are waiting on this. This is crucial stuff, it's like, and so eventually Eisenman, gets the stuff out there. And this what we're looking at an article here that's called The Jerusalem Community of James the Just and the Community at Qumran. And we've gotten into a page or two of this, but the kind of the more important stuff is, okay, he's really arguing that the Dead Sea Scrolls is kind of the background of the Gospels, that it's telling the same story. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are really three major characters. There's the teacher of righteousness, and then there is the wicked priest, and then there is the liar. Some people think that the wicked priest and the liar are the same person. And some people think that the teacher of righteousness is Jesus. In Eisenman's case, he believes that the teacher of righteousness is James, the brother of Jesus, and that the wicked priest is probably Caiaphas, the high priest of Jerusalem, and that the liar is Paul, who tries to take the doctrine of Jesus and Hellenize it or Romanize it, making it available to all Gentiles, getting rid of the, requirement for circumcision and kosher food laws and Sabbath observance. And as a result, he is seen as being the liar. Okay, we're going to see if we can get to the end of this chapter, and then we'll move on to the next essay here. In view of these striking convergences, so, some of the, a lot of the language in the Dead Sea Scrolls is echoed by language either in the book of James, occasionally in some of the Gospels, and then he's looking at a lot of the, he's using this pay-share technique, which is kind of using the ancient texts, the Old Testament texts and so on, as kind of background information to extend the language in the text that you're looking at. That's a bad description. It'll become more clear as we move on. Okay, so Eisenman is talking about how in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are very Jewish, restricted Jews only, and among these Jews, its efficacy is further restricted only to doers of Torah. Against this ideological background of doers, breakers, and keepers of the law, the repeated emphasis in the opening passages of the letter of James on the term doer should not be overlooked. Now, that's why they see Paul as being the liar, because Paul is not one of the doers. He, thinks that the whole thing should be opened up to the Gentiles. So in view of these striking convergences, what has held researchers back from arriving at such results? Primarily, it has been the archaeology and paleography, I think. But he's using the term paleography of Qumran. Now, paleography, however you pronounce that, is like looking at the writing style that is involved, and writing changes over time. And so you can kind of look at the writing style and say this is from the 1st century, or this is from the 1st century BC, or something to that effect. And some kind of crackpot scholars think that you can pin it down within a 20-year period or so. And that's why they're using this for dating the Qumran manuscripts. When did they come from? Are we talking about Jesus here, or are we talking about some other people? Or, is this related to the New Testament text, or is this maybe a precursor to the New Testament text? Now, if you recognize that the New Testament was written by the Romans, then you just ask, did the Romans have access to this Qumran material? Which I think they must have, because they, conquered Qumran during this war. And they certainly had the, manpower to translate the stuff. The Herods knew Hebrew, and also there were a number of Hellenized Jews, including possibly Josephus, Tiberius Alexander, Berenike, the queen, who was a Herod. They were all at the court of Rome. So the Romans could have used this as a model. And there are some specific texts, specific examples in the text where we'll see that, and hopefully we'll bring that up. The adherence to a genre of research in these areas that would not have gone so easily unchallenged in other fields of scholarly research. I have criticized this form of research, the paleography is what he's talking about, at length in my book, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, which is an unfortunate title, I would say, but we'll probably be going through that book as well eventually. Simply stated, the problem is this. Given the present consensus in archaeological and paleographical studies, no real sense can be made out of the internal textual material at Qumran and vice versa. That is, when the real sense is indeed made out of the historical and textual allusions in the Qumran corpus, it is rejected because it does not fit the presumed archaeological and paleographical parameters. In my view, this is a faulty way of putting things together, and I have stated as much. Now, just to give you an idea of the volume of the material at Qumran, it's a ton. They found like 25 copies of I think the book of Isaiah, and like 20 copies of Genesis. Every Old Testament book is represented except for I think Esther, and then they found a lot of sectarian material that's just for that particular sect, like the community rule, the war scroll. These are other texts that are kind of more unique to Qumran, and they are more scholarly interest, because the other books are, the book of Genesis, for example, is almost the same as the other book of Genesis that have been discovered, although it's the oldest, but the oldest that's been discovered. But, it might have a few words different or whatever, but the main interest is in the sectarian material. And that is what the, Dominicans wouldn't publish. As far as I'm concerned, archaeological and paleographical data, impressive as they may be, can in no case be used to rule out an otherwise convincing historical and textual reconstruction based on the clear sense of the internal information. This is true for the matters outlined above, as it is on the subject of, quote, 3 nets of Belial in the Damascus document and Bala or Bela in the Temple Scroll. These are both sectarian parts. The Damascus document was actually discovered much earlier in the 19th century, late 19th century, but then they found another copy at Qumran. They didn't really know what it was when it was discovered in, I believe it was discovered in Egypt. That's why they call it the Damascus document. In the Temple Scroll, which forms the focus of the appendix to chapter 2 of this book. To put it another way, the archaeological and paleographical data that has been analyzed is not secure enough to rule out an otherwise convincing internal analysis that falls roughly within Qumran habitational termini. The paleographical reconstructions at Qumran are particularly subjective and, when analyzed, circular, meaning the sequences assume from the first what they set out to prove. Just like using your Bible as evidence for the existence of Jesus. A particularly important piece of internal data in the total puzzle is the 3 nets of Belial allusion in the Damascus document, the whole circle of Bala and BL language at Qumran, and especially the parallel allusion to Bala or Bela in the Temple Scroll. This language is used not only to relate to the death or destruction of the righteous teacher and other members of his community in several Qumran documents, but it has strong links with Beliar, Balaam, nets, swallowing, and animal imagery in the New Testament and Talmudic literature. The conjunction of nets and Belial is symptomatic. This is how the allusion is made in the Damascus document and hymns. And this is how it is echoed in Revelation 2, in Revelation, in 2 Peter, and in Jude. The allusion in the Damascus document is pivotal for determining the historical provenance of crucial Qumran texts on internal, not external grounds. It is perhaps the only clear historical allusion in the whole Qumran corpus that can be analyzed with precision on the basis of the internal textual data that accompanies it. As stated in chapter 2, appendix, when the results of paleographical and archaeological research are set aside as secondary, it allows an unambiguous dating of Qumran text on internal textual evidence alone. The 3 nets in question are those of riches, fornication, and pollution of the temple. The charge of riches, while also central to the scheme of the letter of James, as indeed fornication is, and all subsequent Ebionite history, is not crucial to the analysis because it can presumably be leveled against any establishment by its adversary